Right, shall we get started? Are we filming, Fraser? Can I just check that we are filming and live streaming or whatever we need to do?
Just threw my lunch, the rest of my lunch away. So
You're right.
Are we good to go? Great. So let's get started. Welcome everybody to the meeting of Merton CCG governing body. We've got apologies received from Julie Hesketh, and Eileen, you're here deputising for Julie. So thank you for coming. We haven't had any other apologies for the meeting, and we're core. Julie, I know that you've got to go at 4 o'clock, so won't be able to stay for the part 2 particularly. And I'll come back to you in a minute. Can I just remind everyone that if we're talking, can you all use the microphone so that it's picked up for the purposes of the audio recording and also is then audible to everyone else? Excellent. So let's get started. Can I just check before we do that the register of interests is accurate? And anything we need to bear in mind for items on the agenda of the Part 1 meeting in relation to particular conflicts of interest? No?
Sorry, Andrew. I've got one
Mike.
thing, which is there's an action or there's a statement next to my name about me being part of the harm review at St George's, and I'm not sure how that's got there. It's on the COI register, but I think it might be a mistake.
Yes, it will be. It will relate to a different GP. It will relate to a different doctor.
So can we just remove that and maybe check who it's meant to relate to and attribute it to them? Thanks for picking that up, Mike. Okay, apart from that, are we happy with it? Yes, that's accurate. Good. So minutes of the previous meeting is item 3 on the agenda. So this is for approval. Were there any issues of accuracy in the minutes of the meeting? Is everyone happy that they were an accurate record of the meeting? Yes? Good. I'll take those as accurate. There's one item on the action log which was relating to the 360 survey of the CCG, and this was a recommendation that we should establish a small group looking at the survey's findings and reporting back to management team. This was sitting with Julie. So Eileen, do you have anything to update on that?
Yeah, the only thing is I've got to link with the comms team to get the group together, so it's in progress.
Okay, so in progress.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, if that's happening, I think we can probably take it off the governing body action log, as long as we then know that it's going to happen and report back to management team.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. That was everything on the action log. Are there any matters arising that we need to discuss before I move us on? No? Good. Okay. So straight on to item 5. The first thing you've got is my update. So there's 2 papers relating to this. The first is just a written chair's report. So I will just take you through the key things in my report. The first one being the locality leads process. So you may recall that we had existing locality leads, which was Karen and Tim, and we took a decision to go back out to the membership and go through a process just to open it up for appointment of new locality leads who represent the changes, represent the localities as they've changed over time. We had applications for both the East and West Merton locality lead roles, but as job shares. So for West Merton, that was Tim Hodgson and Aditi Shah applied for the role as a job share. And for East Merton, it was Moham Sekaram and Andrew Otley. And just to let you know, so Aditi Shah has been working for the CCG over the last year or so as a clinical lead for planned care, so she's known to us. Moham Sekaram is our clinical lead for social prescribing, and Andrew Otley is the clinical lead for mental health. So they're all known to us. We've been through an interview process and we're very happy to recommend them for that role. What we would like to do now is go out to the membership to ratify that, to make sure they've got endorsement from the practices to represent them in those roles. The other thing we wanted to flag up to you is we would like to have the ability to co-opt one or two of them to the governing body, just to broaden the GP representation on the governing body. And I guess I'd really welcome your views on that. Is there anything you wanted to say about that, James?
No, I mean, we need to agree the timescale to go out, but it will be either next week or the week after. We'll just make sure that we're coordinated with any processes that are ongoing with Merton Health, so we don't just trip over each other. I think what I would just flag within the Constitution is that we do have the option within the Constitution to co-opt up to a further 2 members to the governing body, and we'd look to do that with the governing body's agreement under that power. So it's something that we do have the flexibility to do constitutionally.
Sarah?
So yes, I think we do constitutionally. And what I would suggest is that if this is something that the governing body would like to consider for the future, when we come to review constitution as a whole, we may wish to consider permanently adding additional GP members onto the governing body, as is in other CCGs where you have a majority GP representation. So we can do that, and that will go through the constitutional change process, which will include the membership, which I'm sure they would be supportive of.
Thank you. Tim?
Mine was more of a personal thank you to Karen Worthington after 5 years since this CCG started at its inception, for a monumental contribution towards life in East Merton and probably West Merton for that matter. I've certainly valued her support and friendship, so glad we've still got her on the board and part of the primary care team, but just acknowledge the East Merton role, which has been significant.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'd second that, and I think what I'd of course flag is that Tim and Karen, you remain our solo locality leads until the process has been through the ratification through the governing body. So we will agree the process, but ahead of that, I would absolutely second your comments and also note the ongoing contribution that we'll continue to have around both the governing body and also around primary care, which has been instrumental from Karen recently.
And I guess also to note that both Tim and Karen's roles on the governing body are independent governing body roles. They're not linked to the locality lead role that you've been through a process about. So you're going to continue in your governing body roles until the end of your term at least. And obviously, Karen, your clinical director for primary care role continues as well. So we're hoping not to see less of you. Marek.
I just wanted to also reiterate the LMC has always found Karen and Tim, of course, as well, as being really eminently engaged. Well, but Tim's not leaving his role. But what I'm trying to say is that we found you to be a person who's very willing to engage constructively with us, and I think that's really, really important. And we hope that these relationships will continue in the future.
So on the subject of leaving, though, we do have someone actually leaving, which is Julie. So this is going to be your last governing body meeting, isn't it? And we're in the middle of a process to appoint a new nurse. So we're hoping to have concluded that by the time of the next governing body meeting. But obviously this is your last one, and I just wanted to now take the opportunity to thank you so much for your contribution and for your support and for your hard work in the role, and we will miss you, and we wish you all the best with your new opportunities. We've got a small gift, which is behind me. So
it's just seamless.
Hopefully has all the right signatures in it. Does it? Okay. You look like you were wanting to sign it, Karen. which is almost science, Julie.
It's been co-produced.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed all the 2 years, which have gone very, very quickly, and you've all been so supportive in the ideas which I've sometimes brought to the table and questioned, and been very patient with me. So thank you so much. And from when I started, the role in terms of the CCG has changed so much, because we started as an independent and now we're one as with Wandsworth and Merton. So thank you all, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I wish you all well for the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Eileen?
Thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to go back to the subject of the locality leads. That I know that you were looking at support of leads to quality in terms of attendance at clinical quality review groups. And I was just wondering whether this is going to be the opportunity to look at that, because you were asking, I think you've asked us around who attends, which GP leads attend which clinical quality review groups across. And I've got some information which I can speak to you outside of the meeting.
Yeah, so I think we're looking broadly at all the different meetings we're asking our clinical leads, clinical governing body members to attend, and trying to make sure we've got the right attendance at all of them. Having more GPs come on board probably gives us greater breadth to be able to cover all the meetings. So it's something we're going to look at once we've been through the process of ratifying them, so we know they're actually going to be appointed to the role. We can then sit down with them and work out who does what meetings. Okay, let me go on to the other two things in my chair's report then. The third thing was the committees in common. And you, as a late paper, you got the report from the committees in common, and I know we've got that in hard copy form at the back for anyone who's not got it. So I just wanted to make sure you noted that we approved the recommendations that came to the committees in common around the Improving Healthcare Together programme. I know you've all been cited on that, so I don't think there were any surprises in what we agreed at the committees in common. And the final thing is just to note that we've got a date in the diary for the annual general meeting, which is the 27th of September between 1 and 3 p.m. I know that it wasn't possible to do the fullest consultation with all the governing body members in setting that date. That was largely because of the real complexities of the corporate calendar and trying to coordinate a number of diaries across different CCGs. So I'm really sorry if not everyone can attend. We will try and think even further ahead about the date for next year and make sure we really do try and make sure we've got as many governing body members attending as possible. Was there anything anyone wanted to ask or say about any of the things I've covered in my report? No? Okay. Let's go on then to James.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'll take the report as read, just probably a couple of areas to highlight. So I think one important bit of business is that following the committees in common, I attended 2 overview and scrutiny committee meetings last week. The first was a Merton overview and scrutiny committee where we gave a general update on the programme and largely stepped through the same papers that were at the CIC. It's worth just drawing attention to the second meeting, which was the joint overview and scrutiny committee, which was on the Tuesday. Now, that was a meeting of the 6 London boroughs overview and scrutiny committee delegations, and also Surrey County Council's overview and scrutiny delegation. And what that meeting determined to do was to form a subcommittee across Merton, Sutton and Surrey Downs, effectively, although Surrey County Council covering Surrey Downs, to scrutinise the programme. That subcommittee then taking basically delegated responsibility from the joint overview and scrutiny committees for that scrutiny responsibility. It's those 3 at the moment, but what they did say is that if they identified impacts that were going to spread onto other boroughs, that they may consider widening the JOSC arrangements. I think just worth flagging that when we're talking about the Improving Healthcare Together programme, that's going to be the main scrutiny arrangement is going to be that joint overview and scrutiny committee, which I think is very helpful because that means that we have a single subcommittee looking at the issues in totality, alongside the CICs also taking the same view of that. So probably worth just making that point. In terms of continuing healthcare, we're now well progressed with implementing the new arrangements which were discussed at the last meeting, and I think we're already seeing some positive progress there in terms of getting at some clarity about some of the issues that were flagged. We will bring back the detail on the financial implications, particularly in relation to the backlog and what we find as soon as we have them. Two really positive things I want to flag. So Mitcham Carnival yesterday, on the 16th, Mitcham Carnival in June. So we had a health hub. We had a significant presence. Andrew and I were both there. There's a video of somewhere of me making a smoothie on a bicycle, which is not worth watching. I mean, I think the key point is that we had a lot of staff there. It was impeccably organised by our communications team as well, and we had a real impact in terms of engaging people with our work. A lot of people were very interested. A lot of people were signing up for further involvement in the Wilson as well. You know, we had a number of really good conversations, including with both the mayor and the local MP, Siobhan McDonough. So I think that was a really positive thing for us to do, and thanks in particular to the comms team. I also should note the recent appointment of Fiona White, who's a nurse consultant at CCG, is our clinical lead covering maternity and a nurse practitioner at one of our practices as a Queen's nurse by the Queen's Nursing Institute. And this is really for sort of, I think, a lifetime of commitment to the profession, you know, just a really positive bit of news to give in relation to one of our clinical leads. Finally, it is the 70th birthday of the NHS tomorrow. A number of us are attending the Westminster Abbey service, including our longest serving member of staff at the CCG. And then there is a 7-tea party at the East Putney office. And I think Andrew and I are both judging some cake. I understand there are 18 cakes, Andrew, so
I better go for a run tomorrow
Don't
morning.
wear anything too tight. So yes, but if there were governing bodies who wanted to attend, they'd be very welcome.
Any questions for James? No? Thank you, James. Very helpful. Sarah, as Accountable Officer, anything you would like to update
I
us on?
just also want to add my congratulations on the NHS's 70th. I think that, you know, we all are fully committed to the NHS, and I think that's congratulations to all of our staff and everybody that works in the NHS. And I think we are really going to have a really big celebration tomorrow, not just because of the NHS, obviously because of football. I think that's obviously, we'll be celebrating both, but hopefully the NHS will be around a lot longer. I doubt we'll win the football again, so we'll see how that goes. I mean, after this year when we've won the final.
Great, thank you. So, let's go on, shall we, to the first major item on the agenda, which is a strategic item, and it is a public health annual report. Dagmar, do you want to talk us through this?
So I wanted to just set a little bit of context. I don't even dare saying I'm expecting you've read it cover to cover, because it is rather a mighty document and it's more of a resource. But let me start with giving you a little bit of context and then some of the highlights. So you will be aware that I, as a Director of Public Health in a local authority, have a statutory duty to produce an independent annual report. That's not always a completely straightforward task because we've got other, obviously, statutory duties like the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, and one wants to add value rather than duplicate or replace. So this year's report is around tackling inequalities with a particular focus on looking in about what progress have we actually made. And obviously, inequalities in this borough are obvious. You know, we're in Wimbledon. I normally jump on my bike, you know that now, and it's within 15 minutes that I'm in Mitcham, and it's very different there. So I don't need any fancy reports. What is also, I think, significant that both the council and the CCG, as well as our partners, are really committed to do something about these inequalities, and it's sincere and it is consistent. So when I came here, what struck me was that I thought, God, with all that effort, I wonder what the inequality gap has done over time. Yeah, is it narrowing? And it was rather hard to come by that type of information. So what I found was that we had oodles of snapshots of describing the inequalities in all fancy colours. But I couldn't find much about a trend. And when I looked closer at all the snapshots, they actually all described things slightly differently. And I very much remember seeing Jed on a platform describing the gap in life expectancy between the deprived and non-deprived. And then I went to a different meeting, and Andrew was on a platform, and he quoted some different numbers. And that's when I got a little bit sort of worried, you know, as Director of Public Health. And I thought, God, I have to get to the bottom of this. So the purpose was, let me try to clarify what we mean, because we are all so committed to do something about it. But in order to know whether we're on the right track, we have to be a bit more clarity about the data. And I thought, actually, that's pretty quick, and a slim little document with some neat trends will do it. And the more we looked, the harder it became, and became quite obvious why different people were quoting different numbers, and they didn't have the trends up their sleeve, because it is jolly complicated. So what I thought would be slim and easy read turned out to be a rather big document plus a supplementary. But what I felt is, once I've had it between my teeth, I didn't want to let it go. And so what we then said, let's produce a resource that people can dip in and out, where we clarify definitions, meanings, measurements, we analyze the trends over time, and we propose some methodology and measures to go forward. So for our endeavors, for example, the Wilson, I would want to know what's going to happen when we have the Wilson versus when we haven't got the Wilson. So that sets you the context, and it's a little bit almost of an apology that you've got this monster, and I'm sitting next to Andrew, who's always for easy read, and obviously I've already seen his, furrowed forehead. So I am absolutely committed that we're producing an easy read highlight summary as well, and I haven't got that here today. But just in terms of a few highlights, so every indicator, almost every indicator that we looked at, not surprisingly, does show the very well-known East-West divide. And in particular, health indicators that are relevant for the CCG and are the most up-to-date from Public Health England, with the strongest association to deprivation, are emergency hospital admissions, that is very relevant for us, childhood obesity, and also hospital stays for alcohol-related harm. So that's pretty much our prime sort of territory. Now, what is also very important is that we are recommending, if we want and should use life expectancy differentials, that we do use a methodology which is called the slope index. Don't worry too much about it, but if we use that methodology, it compares the 10% most deprived with the 10% least deprived, rather than wards, which change sizes very often. Then the discrepancy in life expectancy is 6.2 years for men and 3.4 for women. What is a more grippy, I think, indicator in a way is the discrepancy in healthy life expectancy, because obviously what we're striving to is not just extending life forever after, but to make sure that people age healthily. And the discrepancy in healthy life expectancy for men and women is 9 years. So that is quite I think, a significant reminder of why we are all working so hard on reduction. And then very importantly, why I started this report is, so what's happening with trends? And actually, unfortunately, pot luck, there isn't just one or two neat things. The picture is mixed. So there are some success stories. So for example, the gap in life expectancy between East and West for women has reduced over time. And that is a little bit out of kilter with national trends, where it's sort of similar. But where it's stuck is with men. So that can tell us a little bit of a story who possibly doesn't benefit from what we are doing as much as we would like. There are also other good news stories, and one I'm particularly delighted because I think it's real. It is school readiness and investment and effort into kids. Setting them up on the right trajectory is absolutely the right thing. That is strong collaboration between a number of public services. We can do something about that. So that's a real success story. There is a success story around employment, so job seeker allowance, and hopefully one can assume that some of the really big activity in the east of the borough for employment has sort of taken fruit. There is some improvement in child poverty, but we're not believing the data. And then there are the majority of indicators that get stuck. There is just no movement, or even they get worse. So male life expectancy, the gap is worse. And then very interestingly, for us to get under the skin, some gaps are actually look as if they get better, but it's sort of a reminder that we really need to understand what we look at. We call it they get better for the wrong reason. It means that the West gets worse than the East. So we have, for example, prevalence in mental ill health. It's getting worse in East and West, but in the West quicker than in the East. So the gap is smaller, but it's nothing to celebrate. Similarly for self-reported well-being. So we can't just say, oh, the gap is getting smaller, tick. We have to unpack a bit. So in summary, and you will have more of the details of the indicators we looked at in the supplementary document, the issue of inequalities is intransigent, and we as partners have to just not let go, basically, and keep our eye absolutely on the ball. Not a single organization can do it, so concerted action beyond political cycles with an eye of the future, not just the short term, is what we have to stick to. And in terms of a bit more monitoring, because we obviously want to understand and have a grip where we are going, what is really important is that we set ourselves realistic timescales, because inequalities of some of those indicators, they're not going to shift by tomorrow or the day after. And if we set ourselves up because we want to demonstrate that our interventions work, we can actually do ourselves a disadvantage. And so what we are proposing as well is that if we monitor reduction of the gap, that we put some proxies in place, that we have a bit of a hypothesis of change, and put some proxy indicators in place so that we know that we're on the right way, but acknowledging that big change in outcomes will take several years. And finally, we have put together sort of standard indicators that are validated, and so we propose that we as partners are quite rigorous and disciplined in how we use, hopefully, the annual report as a resource of a bit more of a standardized approach of measurement. And because it was really painful, the work, and the data are tricky and a lot are not on sub-borough level, we have committed to work with Public Health England and indeed the Institute of Health Equity to say, can we break down a few more indicators that are meaningful for localities into sub-locality level? And that's work for us to take up. So in summary, I am asking you to actually receive the report because it's meant to be my independent one, but I hope that we can share it with colleagues to use as a resource to improve our rigor around inequalities.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. I mean, what's clear when you read the report, which I did in advance of the Health and Wellbeing Board, which received it last week, a huge amount of work has gone into this, and I do think it really does help crystallise some of the issues around inequalities to help us understand them better. I know that when we looked at it at the Health and Wellbeing Board, it was felt to be helpful, and what's clear when we look at the issues of health inequalities at the Health and Wellbeing Board is there really is a collective will across CCG, the council, and all the directorates of the council, that is, and the voluntary sector to really do something about it. And I know you're wanting us to endorse this, but I also note you've talked about consider the recommendations and how we tackle and monitor our action on health inequalities. And I just wondered what particularly you wanted, what do you think we need to do differently or pay more attention to? You mentioned men, so as perhaps a hard to reach group, so maybe we need to think about that. And you mentioned mental health, which I know is increasingly rising up our agenda, and I know we've absolutely committed to doing something about. But what is there anything you would challenge us on?
I think what the report is not sort of in principle about is an action plan for health inequalities, because to be completely honest, I think we have those, and the refresh of the Health and Wellbeing Board strategy will absolutely have that as a focus, and I'm working closely with Josh to align the local health and care plan. So I didn't feel that me producing an independent annual public health report that I want to produce another lot of recommendations, but feed into the systems and processes I have. What I'm proposing as recommendations is that we use this one as a resource for rigor in terms of how we measure and hold ourselves to account. What I have done as well, as I was at it, there is a neat summary of the most recent evidence of what works in terms of tackling inequalities. And it will not surprise you, it is the proportionate universalism. It's a bit of a mouthful, but what it means is target your universal services, so services proportionate to need. What is important in this approach is that you don't just go and look for the extremes, the very poor, because inequalities are a social gradient. And we know from implementation as well that if you single out the deprived, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable, it can be very quickly patronizing, stigmatizing, and problematic. So the trick is that within a universal offer, you are proportionate to need. The other really important bit, which you've heard me saying in other contexts, is the rebalancing between personal level interventions, particularly around prevention, so our classical smoking cessation and healthy weight stuff, and community and population level interventions, which are normally much better for inequalities. So if you look at the smoking ban, what the smoking ban has done to the prevalence as well as to inequalities in smoking is hugely more and more improvement than our smoking cessation services. Now, I'm absolutely not advertising or advocating a dichotomy that I say we only need population level measures. We need both. But at the moment, what we tend to do, particularly in times of financial constraints, we default to personal. Because the personal one are the uncontroversial measures, and so they're the easier ones. And what I'm challenging us, particularly in times of austerity, if we don't want to let go of prevention, we have to rebalance and hold on to population level interventions. And again, I think the Health and Wellbeing Board is actually really up for this. So we have got Chris Lee, our Director of Environment and Regeneration, on the board, and we discussed our local plan. That means what is Merton like as a borough, how our estates look like, our traffic, our transport. So I think the will is there.
Thank you very much. Look, what I'll do now, let me go round. There's a number of people wanting to make comments or ask questions. Let's go round and take all those comments and questions, and if you then want to make a note and respond at the end to pick up anything that has been asked of you. Should we start with you, Sarah?
So thank you. I thought the report was very comprehensive and very helpful, actually, and using it as a resource, I think, is a good approach. I suppose I always kind of come up with that and so what type question. It's the and maybe it isn't an implementation plan, but how do we? I think it's sometimes very difficult for those of us that are trying to plan services and plan our commissioning intentions to know how to prioritise and how to manage some of this, so that actually we do hit the right things in the right areas. So even though it might not be an implementation plan, I was going to ask you, what is the so what, and how will we take that forward as both health and care? Because I think this is not just, as we know, the wider determinants of health is what impacts really on inequalities. What we do is deliver services to those that when they need it. Our prevention is pretty minor in comparison to the amount we spend on actually delivering services.
Thank you. Tim?
Thank you, Dagmar. I'm probably supporting you in your wish. Poor mental health, with that comes obesity, high smoking, suicide, poor unemployment, high healthcare usage, etc., etc., etc. I'm really struggling as a GP, even in West Merton, where it's meant to be leafy and lovely, with childhood anxiety, drugs and alcohol, proper psychological support and services for our mentally unwell patients. It's more of a plea to the governing body and the senior management team that we look at, when you come to budgeting and commissioning intentions, about how we approach mental health, because I still think we haven't got it quite right, and it has such a huge impact on so many other areas of healthcare, whether it's GP appointment usage, A&E attendances, schools achievement, future employment possibilities. So it was just an urge to the senior management. We really need to have a very hard look at levels of investment and support of mental health services.
Let's go. We'll go round in order. So just go one after the other.
Mine's really about how do we raise the profile of a document like this within the CCG across all staff, really, and also obviously external partners in relation to the work we're doing jointly. I've seen it twice because I happen to be on the Health and Wellbeing Board, and I'm seeing it again today, but I'd be aware that other clinical colleagues won't have had the opportunity to see it, and I think it's a really, really valuable document and really should be fundamental to everything that we do.
Thank you, Dagmar, and obviously thanks to Amy as well. My comment, just because I know she helped write a lot of it, my comment really is around looking at some of the golden threads behind a lot of this work, because it's very easy to pick a recommendation off an isolation. And for me, talking of the word isolation, there's a fair bit around the social isolation, the self-management, the social prescribing, and then wrap within that the community resilience that we probably really need to focus on. So I know we're obviously doing the pilots all throughout East Merton and rolling out to West Merton now, which is really positive as well. And I suppose my challenge would then be, can we think, given that there aren't any other metrics, about that sort of social isolation, some of those real determinants, given that healthcare professionals only see a patient 1% of their time. So I think for me it's looking at some of the golden threads, which I think is probably that tier 0, the self-management, social prescribing, community resilience, and starting as a governing body and through a health and wellbeing board, like we're trying to do with the Wilson, to really focus that, because if we kind of get that right for one condition, it then doesn't become a condition, it becomes a sort of a way of working, a way of commissioning, and I think that's the sort of approach that I'd like to see us start to move towards, if possible.
Thank you, Dagmar. It's a really good report. I would agree with a standard methodology. I think the one that you picked looks good, and it's useful then in measuring going forward any improvements and having a standardised approach. I just wonder as well, when we're looking at the equality and diversity group, and I won't be here, but next year, how we link that in with that report, because it's an excellent resource when you're setting up services to look at and use as evidence, and I think it's key that we do that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about this, Dagmar. This is a lot to respond to, so I'm just making a comment rather than ask a question. One thing was just to partly reinforce that point, which is at the Health and Wellbeing Board, there was some discussion that whilst this was a really, really useful look at health inequalities through a particular lens, it also begs the question about if you looked at the world through slightly different aspects of inequality, would it look the same or different? The main thing I wanted to say was around the alignment. So we've also got this year into the autumn a refresh of the health and wellbeing strategy. We've got the development of the local health and care plan, and I think there's an unusual opportunity over the next 9 to 12 months to make sure that all of our planning is jointly aligned really clearly, and I think one of the recommendations in the paper is to make sure that the work we're doing is based on the evidence of need and the evidence of impact. A number of people have reinforced the points around mental health and children's services. Those are the main priorities in the local health and care plan, and they were there because we responded to reports like this and what's in the refresh of the JSNA. So it's just thank you, and again, yes, I've read this twice now and plus had multiple iterations scattered across our kitchen table at home. So thank you.
Murray?
Thank you, Dagmar. I read the report with interest. It's not an easy read, as per Andrew's, I think, definition of one, and I'd certainly hugely welcome some form of high-level, if you like, summary that's easier then to distribute amongst my colleagues so that we can actually look at that. I noted with interest particularly your comments around the quality of data, how that can be affected by poor quality data being recorded in general practice, and I think this is another area that we could actually improve the wealth of your report by improving the data that you are receiving. If the data that you're receiving isn't reliable, then it makes it far more difficult. I also welcomed your comment very much that reducing inequalities does not mean drawing West Merton down, but trying to bring East Merton up. I was somewhat taken aback by the fact that there's an increase in prevalence of mental illness in the West, and I think you're probably very right. People in the West are more probably likely to be seeking help. But it brings to mind a comment that was made by one of the colleagues at the substance misuse board that I attended a little while ago, where there's a perception of how safe do you feel in Merton compared with other boroughs. And interestingly, Merton rated very highly as being feeling unsafe, even though in fact it is a relatively safe borough. So I think there's a significant degree of anxiety around this as well, and that's probably again more related to the West. So generally speaking, fantastic piece of work, gives lots to think about, and I think one of the issues would be how we in general practice can facilitate generating future data which is actually meaningful.
David?
Yeah, so over the years I've read many Directors of Public Health reports, and I think it's refreshing to see this one, so really helpful. I guess I wanted to just relate it to the money side, and really I guess two specifics. One is that broad question around, so how much are we really investing in the sort of the front end health promotion sort of activity? What are we really doing there? And what's our return like on that? So there's something around that. I'm not necessarily saying you can answer that one, but I think there's an issue. The second one, then it comes on to, so how do we use that? Because as we'll hear when we get into the finance report, when we look at the QUIP programme and the future pipeline, this sort of stuff really ought to be driving, probably much more than it is, around how do we know, where are we spending money, how do we use it, are we really getting the targeting right? So again, I guess there's just a question in terms of how do we use this to make sure we're really using this to drive the way we're looking at spending and also our future savings plans.
Okay. And Andrew?
Since we talked about easy reads on a number of occasions, perhaps it's worth commenting that, I mean, as a resource document, it's pretty powerful stuff. I mean, it's really well thought through in detail, and it should be a resource. I think I was also glad to hear that you intended to and are going to give some thought to what would a popular version look like, which brings me to the fundamental issue that comes out of reading this material, which is a lot of it is going to be hard to change in the long term. And in terms of trends, in terms of exceptions, there's not going to be very much for quite a long time, no matter how much money you put in, I guess. So one of the things I think we need to bring out more, or at least make sure that in any popular document or any further refinement that we do, is we need to distinguish between things which are malleable, you know, where we can affect something within a reasonable timescale, and things which are actually, a bit out of reach or so long term that most people would say, well, as far as it's concerned, I'm never going to see anything happening on that front. Because when you get to what are we going to do about it, you don't want to, as you say, spend money on things which apparently might never receive any return. And that seems to me to be one of the critical factors, because there is so much material here with so many variables that it's possible to pick out any one of them and show an improvement or not, or a trend. It's one of the diseases of the NHS that there are so many variables that it's very hard to make sense of them. And your report does make sense of them, which I think is really great. But I think in any further communication in terms of engagement, we have to really take into account that other people will not spend the time to really understand and really get beneath this, and we need to give them some simple messages about what's really happening, where it's heading, and where we can't expect any long-term or results in the long, what results won't happen for quite a long time.
John?
Thank you. It's an excellent report, and I think that just the point of focus from me in the recommendations section, where it talks about we need to take consistent, intelligent action on health inequalities in Merton, based on the analysis that comes before. I guess my reflection is twofold. One, nationally, where are we in terms of any national strategy on health inequalities? And I asked that as a question. I'm not sure there is any national steer, but it'd be interesting to know. And then secondly, in terms of South West London, I appreciate there's a variety across Wandsworth, Richmond, etc. But I wonder whether some of those issues described here are played out in a vastly similar way. In Richmond, for example, perhaps not quite the east-west divide, but there are certainly some wards within Richmond that are very deprived and some that are very, very affluent. So in terms of what actions other parts of South West London are taking, to what extent they're applicable in Merton. Thanks.
Right. I'll take the final comment from Claire, and then I'm going to try and sum up where we've got to and direct
Made notes.
direct for a response, not just from you, but I think I might call in some of the members of the team to respond to certain bits. So Claire.
I think most of what I wanted to say has already been said around the table. I think it is an incredibly valuable resource. I suppose the thing that stands out for me is that issue that with the new, I can't remember what you called it, the new way of measuring the differential, that men are still a huge differential there, and I wonder
how we can understand why that is happening and what we can do to rectify that. I think the other thing was child poverty. You said that the data you're not quite believing. And,
We're digging
and
a bit.
yeah.
So a very broad range of comments and questions, Dagmar. There are just a couple of things I wanted to pick up before I pass it back to you and probably to Josh. Firstly, relating to mental health, which we've talked about a bit. Later on the agenda, we've got the Improving Mental Health Services in Merton paper, which I think will be an opportunity to pick up what we're actually going to do differently around mental health going forward. We've also got the South West London work on children and young people's mental well-being, which I'm leading as well. So there is a fair bit going on, and we can reflect on that when we come to your item maybe. Second thing to talk about, to pick up probably, is social prescribing. So to note that we are doing a lot on that in Merton, and that's proven to be very successful. We had the Merton Partnership Conference yesterday, which was all about social capital, which was really helpful. And we ran a workshop on social prescribing. So myself and Mohan, who's the clinical lead for social prescribing, along with Dagmar, ran a workshop on that. And again, that was really interesting, and it was really good to see the enthusiasm for that. One of the things that's quite clear when you think about social capital and some of the initiatives that we know are adding value is sometimes it's quite difficult to quantify the impact, and the impact and certainly the return on investment doesn't necessarily accrue to health or to the health system. The benefits are sometimes quite broad, and I think one of the things we're trying to explore going forward, particularly as we take forward the Merton Health and Care Together work, i.e. working jointly with the council and voluntary sector and providers, is how do we start to make decisions based on how we improve the health and well-being of our population in a place, regardless of who gets the gain. So I'd like to be able to do stuff because it improves the health of the population, even if we don't see a reduction in A&E attendances and see a reduction in our spend in one area. And we need to grow up a bit about how we work as a system and start making some of those mature decisions. So I'm sure we'll come to that when we talk about what does this mean for our commissioning intentions, what does it mean for our financial strategy. Maybe, Josh, you just want to say a little bit about that and about what this might mean for our commissioning intentions going forward,
Yes.
before I then bring it back to Dagmar.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So a few things. One is the local health and care plan that we're putting together isn't the idea isn't that that's just a nice document that puts together some good intentions, that becomes the basis upon a big chunk of our commissioning intentions for future years. As I said before, a lot of those areas have been picked out because of the evidence base in terms of population health and inequalities. I think to David's point around how do we make sure that this that we articulate and quantify the impact this has on the finances. I think we've made some good steps toward that already. I think the social prescribing project, which you picked out, is actually fairly rarely in the country showing some proper evidence-based impact that has a quick, early impact on the cost of services elsewhere. There's not many places that have been able to demonstrate that, partly because they haven't necessarily done the evaluation work to make it happen. It's not to say it's not happening, but we're able to demonstrate that at the moment, and we can build on that. When we come to the mental health item later, there's also there's a growing evidence base around the impact of primary mental health care on people's conditions and but also their ability to live their lives as they wish to live them, all of which can be quantified in different ways. So absolutely, that's what we'll seek to do. That will get enshrined within a local health care plan. And actually one thing that got me thinking was, so there's a couple of things, I guess, just to flag up. One is that I think part of the challenge of this public health report isn't just about what services we commission, but it's how they're provided. So I think services as well need to take account a bit of the inequalities within Merton and think about how possibly the offer could be flexed. And the other thing is that if we're going to seek to build in some of this work into the way we commission services, you could argue that the way that services are currently contracted and paid for doesn't necessarily follow that all the time. And we've already flagged that. There's already a work stream within Merton Health and Care Together to look at how we incentivise providers to work and how we pay for things. But I'm hoping that in next year's contract we can see some real changes in that direction.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Dagmar, back to you for a final kind of response and wrap up. I think regardless of what you say, we're all quite strongly minded to endorse this report.
Good. And you've been kind and very helpful in your comments. So I will do a final sweep around the table. So first of all, hopefully, Sarah, some of your absolute legitimate challenges of the so what, you have heard some encouraging considerations around the table. The report doesn't go out to say, oh my God, Merton is really bad in tackling health inequalities. Merton is actually really good in tackling health inequalities, but it is tricky to show it. And this is a plea to pay more attention to also showing and evaluating, and we heard some really helpful ways of how we build it into our day-to-day commissioning, into the way we hold our providers to account, into our long-term planning, health and well-being board strategy, local health and care plan, and David's point around investment. So I think there is loads. There is particularly visible effort. There is the commitment around the Wilson, that is in the east of the borough. The social prescribing pilot started in the east of the borough. We have some, luckily, very excellent primary care provision in the east of the borough, so the inverse care law isn't completely relentless in this borough. So we have loads to work from. So hopefully that gives you some encouragement that we're on the right track. I wanted to also pick up how are we sort of socializing this document, what can we do? I think it is good material for lunch and learn, because it is a little bit technical, but it does stretch people's sort of grip on what we actually mean, because we all talk about it and we often mean different things. And that is, I think, lend itself to some sort of shared lunch and learn events that we can use. In terms of Andrew's point around the easy read, for me what is really important in terms of the understanding is not necessarily that I say, oh, because we will only see impact on health inequalities over whatever, 5 to 10 years, therefore we're not doing anything. My plea is that we are realistically setting ourselves up to say we need to have a good hypothesis of why we're doing what we're doing, evidence-based as much as possible, and then construct some proxy measures on the way to life expectancy and have a bit more discipline there so that people don't despair and say, oh my God, I can't do anything, because that is not what I want to advocate. We absolutely can do things, but they take time to feed into the outcomes because the outcomes are multifactorial. But it doesn't mean that we're not doing things. For me, that is really, really important. And then finally, the link with equality promotion, absolutely spot on. So this report is clearly on inequality reduction with a sole focus on deprivation. And we have already planned that it needs to have a follow-up, a sister or a brother, whatever you call it, that looks at other equality characteristics. And it might be a follow-up on your public health report that would quite neatly complement, because we have the challenge rightly in the Health and Wellbeing Board. Disability is a very important protected characteristic that we haven't done enough justice, I think, gender, as we've shown here. So more work to be done.
Brilliant, thank you. So we're very happy to endorse that, Dagmar. Let's go on to next thing on agenda, which is finance. So we've got the summarised minutes of the Finance Committee from April, and then we've got the month 2 finance report. Will you just do you want to just pull out the highlights from that, Leon? Okay.
Do you want to do?
Can I just a couple of things? So we've had another meeting since then. So there was a meeting on the 19th of June. I think as board members know, it's now it is a committee in common across Merton and Wandsworth. That's important. I guess the other thing that we've now started with James is a conversation that's taking place across all the finance committee chairs, and we had one the other week, and I think that's really, really important that we work in that way as well. I guess just the other thing, and Neil can talk about in more detail. I mean, the numbers, it's very early in the year, so a lot of the data was only for the first month. So, but I think, Neil, you'll pick it up around some of the risks that are emerging. They're noted in the report. Just want to make a comment on, and then Neil and maybe James want to comment, is around St George's. So the issue around the financial risk relating to the RTT at St George's. We have invited the finance director of the trust to come and join us at one of our finance committee meetings. That's not necessarily just to give him a grilling and hold him up against the wall to find out what's going on, but I do think it's really important we've got that relationship with the trust, and I think it'd be quite helpful to explore it from their perspective. What are the issues? And then clearly there is a point in terms of, well, how are we going to do this going forward? But I think that's really quite important we start to get that relationship, and it obviously works with Neil and James as finance directors, but making sure that the committee's also got some insight into that and build that relationship, I think, is really important as well. So that's what we're doing, but I'll leave it with Neil to pick up the detail.
Okay, so obviously you'll see the report is a fairly slimmed down version on the reports that you generally get, and as David said, that's more a reflection of the time of the year that we're at. Acute data is only just really starting to flow through, and similarly with prescribing data as well. So at the moment we're saying there is a forecast that we're forecasting to the plan. Within that there are some risks within that, as David has alluded to. So the RTT in particular at St George's is an area that does concern us. It concerns us as much by the fact that we don't really know what the size of the problem is, when it's likely to come through and what the impact is. What we do know is it's likely to have a material impact for local commissioners, so particularly for Merton and Wandsworth. So it's really just to know that. And the other risk that we've really got is around the QUIP plan. Also to note on the QUIP plan, we've now identified all the schemes, or we're in the process of finally having the schemes all identified. Merton had a relatively low, or has a relatively low unidentified level of 600,000. We believe we're now at the stage where we've identified all the schemes to go in there, so we have a fully identified QUIP plan. And also to note that we've managed to agree QUIPs into the contracts, which wasn't a case that we had last year where there was a significant amount of QUIP outside of it, and that did complicate some of the reporting, so it'll be a lot more visible in terms of the acute plans and the activity going through what exactly the issues are and where the QUIP actually isn't delivering on that. So given that there are some of the schemes that are now we've identified, we clearly have other issues around potentially red rated schemes or schemes that there'll be a bit of slippage around that. We have got pipeline schemes that we are looking at developing mainly for 1920, but where we think we've got opportunity in 1819, we will obviously look to accelerate those and bring them in to this year. So I think in terms of the position, that's about as much as I was going to say, because it's fairly dry at this time of year, but noting what those risks are, and they are real risks as they go through, and the acute data just in general, you know, we all know that is an area that we need to keep a close eye on. And actually this month, and the Finance Committee this month will have the first opportunity to see that early sight of the data, which usually gives us a good indication of how the year is going to start to play out, even at this very early stage. The financial statements are at the back of the pack. Nothing in there really to flag, other than to say the better payments practice, we are currently failing that target. We know the areas that are causing that issue, and we have an action plan in place, but we need to ensure, given that this has probably been going on now for about 6 months, we don't need this to drag on any longer. So I flagged that really as a risk that's there at the moment, but we do have a plan in place to resolve that. So ask the governing body to note the report. I'm happy to pick up any questions.
Go, David.
I mean, perhaps just come back sort of to in terms of the role of the board and the committee. So I think what we've now got, I think, is because we've got the two committees, there is a sense to me there's some advantage of having both committees in the same room scrutinising all the numbers of both CCGs, because I think as a board, sort of what assurance can the board take that actually that the committee in common is actually doing its job and scrutinising all the numbers. So I can say as the chair from the Merton, so we're doing that. We're all over the numbers. So I think there's an element of assurance that the board can take from those processes. And I say because we've got two groups in one room, makes it a long meeting, but at least you've got really good scrutiny on that. So I think that's really positive. There are, as Neil said, there are some challenges in the numbers, and certainly when we get the next month's numbers, then I think we'll see that. But at least we've got, our processes are robust here, so I just wanted to add to that.
James, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I think on that, the impression would be that I think in terms of the plan that we've set and the way that we're set up for when we start to see the acute data, I think we're on the front foot this year in a way that we weren't last year. But the plan is, if anything, in absolutely pure terms, as tight as it was last year, if not a little bit tighter. And because we've had a year of really robust scrutiny around the balance sheet, around the way that the budgets work, we're not going to find the same sort of fortuitous headroom that supported us last year. So I wouldn't want to underestimate the risk. Just a bit of further assurance on the Better Payment Practice Code. This is now subject to sort of some personal reinforcement by email at the moment from me to make sure that when messages go out about sorting out invoices on time and getting POs raised, that it happens. And we'll continue with that, because this is just something that we just need to be slick out from a process perspective. So there's some senior leadership attention going on, because this would not be a good thing to start to fall behind on.
Claire.
I just wanted to check a detail on slide 7. The 5th bullet point, where it says we plan to achieve the mental health investment standard, although this is not yet fully committed, which means there is some contingency to mitigate against potential cost pressures if necessary. Those cost pressures would be to do with mental health issues, not more generally.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Can I just ask one position of clarity? You mentioned, David, about you'd asked someone from St George's to come. I met with the chairman of, with the audit chair of Wandsworth, our opposite numbers in St George's a while back, and we were talking then about the lack of real contact in sort of operational work that we both do. And I'm just wondering whether there's a better approach that we could, bring to the whole exercise of liaising and contacting the hospital.
That is a very good suggestion, and in fact,
so you will have had an invitation to a session in September where we are having a meeting with St George's, which will certainly be the whole of the exec side of the board, and will be their chair and some of their key non-execs as well. We're just confirming the precise attendance for exactly that purpose, to start to have some of those discussions. And I met with the Director of Strategy of George's this week to plan that session.
I just think we need to think carefully about all of our providers. So St George's is one of our providers. We also have Epsom St Helier. We also have South West London St George's. I think we just need to think about, because I think, so the discussion so far has been very focused on St George's, and normally I would say that's because we are the lead commissioner, but we're not the lead commissioner for St George's. That's Wandsworth CCG. So I think from a Merton perspective, I just think we need to think through how do we do these relationships generally, not just for one individual provider. And I do recognise that we're doing the board to board, and that's very specific, and I think we need to do that. But I think how do we maybe think about how do we work with audit chairs and finance committee chairs across South West London, and how do we build those relationships in a different way, because there are a number of providers in our patch, and we need to kind of have equal footing with them all, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. There's a risk because we're a LDU with Wandsworth that when you combine it, St George's is our biggest provider by a way. However, 40% of our outpatient activity for Merton CCG goes to St Helier. So you're absolutely right. We cannot be just St George's orientated. Julie?
Just one question, I may have missed it, but do we know when we're getting the data from St George's? Okay.
So the data's there now. So the CSU who are processing the data for us are currently pulling all that together, and we will be having a meeting on Friday. I'll probably have a chance to view it before we meet the CSU on Friday, but Friday is where we'll formally go through the data. It's just the national process that we're going through. This is just when the data is available for us to look at. It's not that they've delayed it, it's the fact that that's the way the system works.
So this is always a difficult time of year.
Sorry, are you talking about the RTT data?
So there's a number of processes in play around that. I mean, we are currently working very closely with them to get a plan of what work they are going to do and what work they're going to look to have done across the system in 18-19 in order to reduce some of their key backlog areas, and actually discussing kind of the level of granularity of that plan and its timeliness is part of, I think, what the discussion that we want to have through the Finance Committee when they attend. In terms of their actual reporting of RTT waiting times, if that's the question, they have to go through a return to reporting assurance process, which we'll be heavily involved in, where basically ourselves, NHS England and NHS Improvement, check every single aspect of their waiting list reporting and validation process to make sure it's fit for purpose before they start formally reporting again. And that process will happen over a number of months. Now, at the point where we think that they're collectively that they've done shadow reporting for a few months and that there haven't been any sort of further hiccups and that we've got a consistent set of numbers, then we will initiate that process for them to start to return to reporting. But in a way, the process to return to reporting, having not been reporting, is very rigorous compared with the checks and balances you do when you're just reporting anyway and they've never had an issue. It's a very heightened level of assurance and scrutiny because of the issues that have taken place in the past. So we're hoping for, in the course of this financial year, but it will be quite an involved process for them to get there.
Sorry, there's two or three things there for me. One is there's the formal reporting, but there's also when will we know what our risk is and when it will, and I hope that it'll be much quicker than we get into the formal reporting. And my view would be that for South West London, we need to know this as quickly as possible, and we need to be pushing, and we will be pushing the trust to get that absolutely. And I know the team are doing that. So that's the first one. And as soon as we have got some information on that we are able to share, we will share that with the governing body. The second bit is just around the normal reporting process that we're in, and month one we have the data needs to go through the kind of machine that comes out the other side with an answer that says, based on what happened last year and all these other things, this is what we think your risk is. But even when we get that, we're only going to have 1 month's worth of data, and actually you cannot make decisions based on 1 month of data because it will change throughout the year, and it's very, very early to be making assumptions. So again, everyone gets very excited about the first month's data, and then it doesn't really mean very much. So the most important thing for me is that we keep on with our QIP, with our delivery, and ensuring that we're focused on that, because I think regardless of what happens with the month-to-month figures, I don't think it tells you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was for noting. I think we've spent enough time looking at the finance. We need to go on to the governing body assurance report, and I'd like us to be fairly brief on this because I want to make sure we actually set aside enough time to have a proper look at the mental health item, which I think is really important. So, John, over to you on the assurance report.
Okay,
I know it's been to the Integrated Governance and Quality Committee in May. So I guess the key question is what do you need to flag up to us?
Okay, thank you. I think just 4 points I wanted to flag up. I'm happy to take any questions. Report is here for noting. The 4 points of detail I wanted to briefly raise. First of all, A&E. It's been a relatively strong start to the year for George's in terms of A&E performance. June is looking like it's going to be, once all fully validated, about 1% below target of where they intended to be. But a huge amount of work going on at the moment in terms of both the 15-point plan that I've mentioned previously, and also in terms of a considerable look at the moment in terms of specialty level breaches and what mitigating actions can be put in place to further improve the breach analysis in a very recent way. So ensuring that medical rotas, for example, are matching current demand. So some very timely and helpful actions underway in terms of A&E and sustaining the recent improvements in A&E performance. Secondly, I wanted just to pick up briefly winter planning, although it seems somewhat odd to be doing winter planning quite so early, and this is very much the earliest I think it's ever been initiated. We are partway through some winter planning, learning lessons from last winter in terms of those points of pressure that the system came under, what more can be done to mitigate them, and some modelling of bed occupancy, demand and capacity for various services. And I think all of that probably puts us in a strong position, whereas previously this work has started in the autumn, the early autumn, but still I think a step forward in terms of the work colleagues are doing to model winter pressures and to ensure our plan is as good as it can be for the winter 2018-19. Thirdly, I wanted just to update the governing body briefly on the electronic referral system. So St George's achieved paper switch off at the beginning of the week. There's a national deadline of October this year whereby all referrals to all services need to go through the ERS system, so no longer will GPs or other colleagues be able to send paper or email or faxes. It's been a relatively seamless process over the first few days of this week. There have been a few technical issues that are being resolved, but otherwise I think a significant amount of work by several people in the CCG and colleagues at St George's who've led on this process of taking a myriad of ways of referring into George's and made a much smaller number of ways to refer into George's, and the vast majority of referrals now going through ERS. Those that don't end up as part of a safety net returns process, and colleagues at St George's have very much adequately staff that resource to make sure that nothing gets lost. And we're in the process now of weekly meetings looking at the numbers of referrals that fall into that safety net and the numbers that go through seamlessly and transact as an electronic booking. And fourthly and finally, just a brief update on mental health features further in the agenda, but just to update on IAPS. Since last governing body, we've met with NHS England. James has met with the Chief Exec of Ad Action, and ongoing work to stabilise performance over the course of this year, while we continue with some interim procurement and some. Thank you. While we continue with some interim provision and then the full re-procurement, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for soldiering on through that, John. Just a quick thing on ERS, so the e-referral system, the online referring process that we're now requiring all GPs to use. Are we really confident that any referrals that don't get made through ERS are going to be looped back, and that number one, patient care is not going to be delayed, and number two, they're not going to get lost?
I think that's a really good question, and that's always been my main concern about achieving paper switch off, that safety net process of returning paper referrals works. I think there's two things that give me assurance that it is an adequate process. One, the elaborate flowchart of how the return happens has had clinical engagement from a Merton GP colleague and from Wandsworth. So we've had 2 GPs look at that process and work with St George's to iterate it and develop it. I think secondly then, once that flowchart was perfected, it was then the resource to actually staff and administer that. And St George's have put or made available up to 12 people. I don't know how many of those they've used or how many they've needed to use with numbers that have been going through, but they've allocated within their bookings team 12 individuals who now transact that process.
And do we have any mechanism in place to kind of real-time monitor it and get an early warning if things are going a bit awry and to intervene?
We do. So we got a weekly meeting. The meeting happened a couple of hours ago, so I haven't had the feedback of the first meeting, but we've now got weekly meetings that looks at the numbers that are going through that process, the timeliness. I mean, it's the first 3 days now of the process, but those weekly meetings will continue, and I'll get the feedback later from this afternoon's meeting.
Tim?
Hi, John. Yeah, we've I think a few of the Wandsworth team have very helpfully sent out some information about St George's and some of the support networks. I think we're still waiting for the phone number of the help desk. There is an email address that's been supplied with that package, but I think the number was still to be confirmed, so if we can try and chase up that phone number. There are still some problems. It's quite hard to navigate. I'm an avid choose and booker, as you know, and or ERSer. But there are still clinics missing that they say. I'll just give one example. It's the thyroid clinic, a benign thyroid clinic. Sounds odd, but the advice is, just send it to general surgery. There isn't a general surgery clinic. The consultants who we are directed to see via some of the other ERS entries that don't have those clinics. But so there is still some, which takes a very long time. And I'm a keen ERSer, and therefore I've spent time with the system. I'm slightly concerned about my colleagues who are not keen ERSers, who are doing this, obviously. And it's really, how are we gathering that real-time data / support for our primary care colleagues in this first week? And actually, are we going to have a little reassess in a couple of weeks just to see how everyone's getting on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe just in addition to that as well, if a GP has a patient who they want to refer and they can't find it on ERS, what do they do?
So they go through the defer to provider route, or as in they can't find the clinic at all? Or
Yeah,
sometimes there's literally nothing that resembles what you're trying to find. This thyroid one was an example.
So I think at the moment we'll confirm the telephone number, but it's the help email address, and I think we've got the CCG version of that as well, which a colleague is monitoring daily. I mean, absolutely, there are, as you say, those examples where the system still isn't working. I think it's vastly better than it was a couple of months ago. And St George's have been doing a lot of work now to take away the gateway referral assessment services, which have been placed over some clinics for various reasons while ERS has been developed. But on those particular examples, we need to keep feeding those back. They'll go to the weekly meetings, and we'll deal with them as well outside. But in terms of the agenda for the weekly meeting, it is those anomalies which form a standing agenda item.
Sorry, Andrew, I just replied to that. I just wonder, we've just received an email about we've got a locality meeting in about 2 weeks' time on the 18th and 19th of July. I do wonder if it might be worth one of your team or you coming to that locality as a bit of a sense check of some of the stuff we've got in place.
Absolutely. I'm happy
before
to
the summer break. Then
I'll check diary, but happy to.
I think it's anyone just to gather a bit of feedback to help you in those meetings, and also just give a voice to some of the things that they may, or troubles that so troubleshoot a bit.
Absolutely. I just responding in general, I think my overall, I've been away for a couple of weeks just ahead of this, but I think reflections from the team have been that the process hasn't necessarily been always as perfect as we'd like, but I think the stage we've got to as of the beginning of July, moving to paper switch off, has been some significant work on all sides really. But absolutely, we need to get those remaining anomalies, those residual issues, and have them closed down over the next couple of months. So by the beginning of October and the national deadline, that Merton, Wandsworth, and St George's are in a very good state. We're working obviously with other trusts in southwest London, but we're working through a lead commissioner arrangement with those. So Sutton, for example, is working with Epsom and Helier.
Marek, do you want to make your point? And then
Thank you. I'm, unlike Tim, I'm not an avid ERS user. In fact, I'd term myself to be somewhat of a dinosaur. But I think one of the things that is really important is to try to ensure that you use the word for it, seamless. And I think as this is theoretically meant to be done as much as possible within the context of a consultation where a patient is present. It really needs to be as simple as possible, with the referral process being as simple as possible. What I'm a little bit concerned about is that there will suddenly be a large number of deferred to providers because people simply won't have the time to be researching every single detail. The other issue is I've been told repeatedly that if you want to refer to a particular consultant, and patients very often do want that, it is meant to be within the body of the referral letter that this is mentioned. And I just worry that actually this seamlessness is actually somewhat superficial rather than genuine. The other issue that I just wanted to raise, and this comes back to an issue that Sarah raised earlier as well in her comment about being lead commissioner with St George's, but having a lot of Epsom St Helier. Epsom and St Helier, we need to try to make sure that the systems here for St George's are the same or the similar for Epsom St Helier and for Kingston and for everything else, so that we don't suddenly find ourselves, well, how do I do it for this trust and how do I do it for that trust? If you've got a patient in front of you, you do not need to have that aggravation for everybody.
John, I might respond for Marek, just saying actually St Heliers actually do really quite a good job on ERS. They're often one of the more acceptable and available trusts. I'd say some of my focus would be maybe on Kingston a little bit, some of the areas they still miss, and then George's.
I think the opportunity for variation will be in how they return from whatever date they achieve paper switch of, how they return non-electronic referrals, and we need to make sure that is fairly consistent. I think George's have got now a very robust process. I mean, admittedly, we are just a few days into that, and we will monitor it closely, but we need to make sure a very similar process is available from the other trusts who receive referrals other than ERS, that they are returned and rebooked appropriately.
Thank you, John. Can I try and shift this on from ERS? Is there anything else in the report that people want to pick up? James?
So John mentioned the IAPT and the fact that I'd met the Chief Executive of Adaction. This took place 2 weeks ago, and it was a constructive and very frank meeting, particularly as I think 2 weeks before Sarah and Josh and I had a very frank meeting with NHS England about it as well. So I was able to pass on some of those, some of that. I mean, what I would say is that they are. They're very committed to seeing out the rest of the contract in a very positive way. They accept that there are a number of steps that they need to take, and there are a number of things that they're putting in place. Specifically, they are putting in place steps to make the act of actually getting into the service through the forms on their website a lot quicker and easier, because they're seeing a huge number of patients drop out between actually logging on, starting the form and finishing it, which should be one of the easiest ways to not lose people, really. It should be very quick and easy. And they'll also be doing further work in terms of GP engagement as well, because they're seeing, the self-referral numbers are fine, but the GP route referral numbers possibly not so much. Now, it may be that actually a lot of the GP referred patients are coming up as self-referral because of the way that we've set that up. Just one other further point, which we've asked them for specific assurances which are yet to arrive about, is around, so you'll see within the paperwork that they're seeing patients for first contact very quickly, but actually quite a large number of patients are waiting for subsequent treatment. And what we have asked them for specific assurances about is the quality management and quality surveillance of patients who are waiting for that subsequent treatment. So once I have those assurances, we'll make sure that they're played back to Quality Subcommittee, IGQC, and the governing body as appropriate.
Thanks, James. So as we've got onto the subject of IAPT, I'm keen now to move us on to the substantial item on the agenda on mental health. This was for note, the performance report, so I think we've noted and interrogated that, and let's go on to 9.1, shall we?
Thank you. So I'd just like to introduce Patrice. Patrice, I think if you could sit on the end near a microphone, that'd probably be easier for the presentation, rather than feeling like you have to stand in front of the microphone there and do it by song, which is or here, whichever is comfortable there. there. I think as we've segued from the performance report, obviously the discussions at the governing body around psychological therapy services in Merton have largely been on the struggles we've had with performance of the current provider. That doesn't match with our aspirations for mental health in Merton, as I think we've seen in the discussions today and previous discussions around the Merton Health and Care Plan. Patrice is going to run through our proposals for a new service that would come into effect from April next year. We'll run through some of the key aspects of the services, and happy to take any questions or comments that you may have. Patrice, over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrice Beverny. I commission mental health services for Merton CCG. I'd like to start by giving apologies for Andrew Otley, who's the clinical commissioning lead for mental health in Merton. He would have liked to have been here to give this presentation. Thanks for the opportunity to talk for me, extending to me to talk to you about our proposals for primary mental health care services in Merton. We're in the midst of a project which, as Josh has just said, should see, we're hoping that we'll begin a procurement in September or arrive at a decision by the governing body in December, and mobilisations should begin in February, with the service becoming fully operational by April 2019. The key aims of the presentation today are to give you an outline of the commissioning objectives, describe very briefly current mental health provision in Merton, describe some of the limitations of that provision, describe the new service, and then go on to discuss, I suppose, some of the benefits we hope to accrue from the new service. Right. So one of the key aims of changing mental health provision in primary care in Merton is to meet some of our constitutional targets. In particular, our IAPS performance is not where it ought to be. We've given a commitment to increase the number of people entering treatment to 19%. We've ostensibly got a contract with AdAction for 15%. We're in the midst of a mini procurement exercise to fill the gap between those two, but that's not part of this discussion. The other thing that we're hoping to do is to introduce a means to control access to secondary mental health services, and also to facilitate discharge from secondary mental health services. I think it's important that we have some kind of a break on the system in secondary mental health care. We also have some money committed to secondary mental health services, which arguably could be used more effectively for the benefit of a greater number of patients. We will also, in the process of commissioning new services, get something clinically effective, something of proven efficacy in the primary care realm, which we don't commission as a CCG at the moment. And we could also, in the process, make changes to the mental health system, which will have a broader impact on the wider health economy. So I'm not sure if you are able to see the third slide, but that's my illustrative attempt to describe mental health service provision in Merton at the moment. We've got one primary care service, the Merton IAP service, and we've got one secondary service which provides quite a number of services. Not all of them are represented in the slide. There are limitations to this which relate to the aims which I described earlier on. So our IAP service treats too few patients, as I've already said. IAP services, with effect from this year, should have a great offer for people with long-term conditions. At the moment, our current provider has made some effort to treat people with long-term conditions, but I'm hoping with procurement we can build on their successes. There's a lack of choice in primary mental health care in Merton at the moment. I think if you look at the way what we've commissioned, certainly people with severe mental illness have no support until the point where they reach the criteria for secondary services. So hopefully with our reprocurement we'll be able to introduce services which will address that. And the new services which we'll introduce should not just have a focus on mental illness, but also people's physical health conditions as well. So if we go on to the fourth slide, I've tried to describe in this slide the services that we intend to commission, or the way services will look. So this is very similar to the way services are arranged in Sutton at the moment, if you're familiar with Sutton Uplift. In Sutton Uplift, they have a point of access or a single point of assessment, and as I've shown them here, four different service choices, broadly speaking, and I've described them as steps. So at the bottom rung, we've got mental well-being, which will be focused on social inclusion. We've got the IAP service, which I've talked about already, and we've got primary care recovery, which would all be part of our primary care procurement, form part of our primary care procurement plan. The primary care recovery element is the bit which is aimed at people with severe mental illness, ideally people with stable psychoses and some of the more complex depression and anxiety disorders. The purpose of this service will be, like I said, to provide a break on people's progress to secondary care, but also provide a pathway out of secondary care, certainly off of community mental health team caseloads.
I'm actually on the server for a reading report and I clicked on something.
Okay, well maybe he's doing it better than I am, but if you don't mind. Okay. Right, so the IAP service, walking down the steps, will have a better focus, I think, than we have at the moment on people with long-term conditions, as well as the general focus on treating the general population with common mental health problems. One of the ambitions, one of the ambitions that the 5-year forward review sets for us is that 2/3 of our expansion in people treated by IAP services or through IAP services should have a long-term condition, recognised with a long-term condition. And then with the mental well-being bit, or social inclusion bit, this is a part of the service provision which I anticipate will be provided by members of the voluntary sector. So it's a way of this CCG engaging the voluntary sector to do some of the things that they do best, working more flexibly with the local population, tapping into local communities, existing communities, using those strengths. Okay. So primary mental health care services are not new, although I guess this is new for Merton. They've been introduced across the UK, or England I should say, and locally in Kingston, in Richmond, and in Wandsworth there are examples of this. Like I said, we're trying to emulate the Sutton model. Sutton's uplift service is very similar to the Lambeth Living Well project. Lambeth Living Well project describes itself as a collaborative where the NHS and the voluntary sector work in partnership with services commissioned by the local authority. And Lambeth in 2017, looking back on the service, how the collaborative had worked in that locality, were reporting a 23% reduction in referrals to secondary mental health services. Sutton Uplift model, I think, will be really important for us reaching our access targets. The way commissioners and providers in Sutton have described the wellbeing access of their service, for me, it creates like a pool of clients who are appropriate for IAPT. And certainly the provider in Sutton has told me that, the commissioner in Sutton has told me that before the Sutton Uplift model was introduced, they did struggle, like we do in Merton, to get our access targets right. And that collaborative, that partnership with South West and St George's as NHS and IAP provider, and the wellbeing provider in the voluntary sector has created that clear pathway from getting no help to getting IAP. So I'm hoping that will be helpful to us in reaching our IAP target in Merton. I think also there is good evidence from the IAP's long-term conditions pilots that have been run in various parts of England that there should be benefits accruing to the acute care sector. So these pilots, some of them are actually describing extraordinary benefits, I would say, to the local health economies where they're working. Certainly they are describing reductions in ambulance usage, GP attendances, A&E attendances. Bearing in mind these are pilots and these are early days, but I would hope that we will be able to emulate those results in Merton as well.
Thank you, Patrice. I anticipate we're going to have quite a few questions and comments and thoughts, and so I want to give everyone a really good opportunity to do that. So we might, if we end up running a bit further on with our part one, that's fine. We'll try and, as best we can, make up the time in part two. As I'm chair, I'm going to take the opportunity to go first. What I suggest we do is, if people give their thoughts and comments, and then if people, when they give their feedback, build on that rather than making the same point, and then you can get a flavour of what the kind of things we might want to know are, and then I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that. So if I go first. I mean, some of this fits in with, we had a presentation at the South West London Clinical Senate last week on mental health and what the thinking was across South West London. So this obviously ties in with that. I think it would probably be helpful if we understood the proposed new model a bit better. I don't think many of us would be really very familiar with the Sutton Uplift model, although we've heard of it. So it'd be probably quite helpful to hear that fleshed out a bit, certainly if we see this coming back, to build on that and have a little bit more detail about what it would really look like. There were three particular things I wanted to comment on. The first was just understanding more about that primary mental health service. How's it really going to deal with the non-medical factors? How is it interfacing with universal wellbeing services? And what's the expectation for involvement of GPs if it's called a primary mental health service? Understanding how that creates a kind of much more synergistic relationship with primary care would be quite helpful. The second thing is, there's a lot of focus on the primary mental health care bit, but when you look at the description of secondary care services, it's very fragmented. So be quite interested to know that if this isn't just about what we do in primary care, but presumably we have a whole system strategy for improving mental health and well-being, and part of that is going to be the very front end. The other bit is actually joining up secondary care services, so it's not home treatment team passing to rapid response team or whatever, but rather a much more holistic response. And then the third thing is about the money. So what I'd like to understand is what the financial impact of this is. So are we putting additional resource into the primary mental health service and planning on disinvesting from secondary care, or are we protecting our spend on secondary care and putting additional investment into primary mental health care services? And how are we going to measure the impact of our investment? Are we just thinking about what savings we might get from A&E attendances and all the stuff on comorbidity? Are we thinking more broadly about not just benefit to our health spend, but benefit to our entire system? I really think this lends itself to the Merton Health and Care Together approach, because it's going to have knock-on impact on employability and all sorts of other services that are nothing to do with our budgets, but are frankly going to really improve the system position. That was my feedback. Tim?
I can't stress enough how much time gets spent on mental health as a GP. I've got specialist little clinics for 6 or 7 really rather unwell patients who come back and have half an hour slots or sometimes hour slots. The bit I need to be really clear on is we've got a reactive system, because we're great in emergencies generally. Actually, most people know what to do in an emergency, both medical and or mental health and physical health. And fine if you can wait 6 months for your IAPT appointment to talk about some low-grade depression. Okay, what do we do for the other 6 months in between for these people that have really got quite debilitating mental health problems that are then impacting their work life, partners, children, etc. So whatever model we've got, I mean, primary care is going to be key. And the other thing is close to home and accessible. You know, whatever we bring, we need to bring something that people can actually turn up to. You know, it's all very well having a model, but if no one comes, because it's during office hours, and that's, pretty hopeless. So, people sometimes do like being seen near their homes. We look at, an accessible, widespread service that reacts to the more acute nature of some of these problems. So that's what I desperately beg from you.
Okay, let's go round, shall we? I'll give everyone the opportunity. Karen.
I think, yes, building on what Tim's just said, I think the diagram actually does a bit of a disservice to GP colleagues. There should be another circle there. I know you've got primary care as the top heading, but actually you've got IAPT as a separate provider. We are commissioners of primary care, and primary care sees a huge amount of mental health patients. So I think we probably should put another circle on there. The other thing really that I'd like to say is around, like Andrew said, I don't think I really understand what the proposed model is, but we need to be mindful that we're not actually shifting a large amount of work that's currently being done in practice out into another service, thereby perhaps de-skilling GPs or making GPs feel that that's not their business anymore. And finally, around things like physical health checks, we do actually commission primary care under QOF to do those physical health checks for people with long-term mental health conditions. Have we looked at the quality of those and actually the achievement of what we're already commissioning before we start to actually commission another service to perhaps either top it up or provide it instead of?
Eileen?
Thank you. Just a couple of points that I wanted to make. So the first one is around any model that we want to take from other areas, that we ensure that there's been a proper evaluation of that model and how it's worked, what have been the outcomes, and also how then do we adapt that model to meet the needs of Merton, that we are not just lifting a model from another area into Merton. And then the second point is around the quality oversight of this service. I think currently with the current provider, there is a gap there in terms of how we've been monitoring the quality of the service. So with this new service, we just need to look at what's the quality governance arrangements aligned to any service that we are procuring.
Thank you. Marek?
Thank you. I reiterate the comments made by my colleagues about primary care, general practice being involved. And one thing that I would ask is whatever model is adopted, that for us GPs it's made as simple as possible for us to understand how easy it is, or the easiest way of accessing this for patients. We're simple people and simple processes are easier for us. But the other issue I wanted to raise is there's a lot of emphasis here, from what I can see, about the collaboration with voluntary services. Just really wanted to understand what capacity do you think voluntary services in Merton have to be able to absorb or support the work that you want to have done for people suffering from mental illness? Because if the infrastructure in the voluntary sector isn't there, then it's not going to have any impact.
Okay. David?
Yeah, so I was going to pick up the question about the money. So is it new money or is it meant to be self-financing? So I would assume that, and has Neil got this money reserved somewhere? If it is, so you might want to answer that. So that's all. But I think the main issue I wanted is around. So what are we looking to procure? Because I wasn't. When I first read this, I had in my mind this was around primary care, and primary care to me means, the way it's written here, it's what GPs do. If what we're really saying, actually, no, it's more than that. It is about all of this sort of stuff that goes on, everything from what's happening with GPs, the voluntary sector, where's social care, housing, employment, and all of that. That's a much, actually, it sounds a really good integrated way of delivering those sort of services. But if that's the model, then how are we going to procure that? And then this point around, so where are the providers out there? Are they really going to be able to deliver that sort of very integrated service? Because if that's what we're looking for, it will imply that the providers have to do a lot of work together to actually network themselves to deliver what's in our specification. So I think there's quite a lot around are we really clear in terms of what's that model, how might it work?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say really, really welcome the work. I know it's a bit at the start, but it is the right direction, and it reflects really on the previous discussions we had. So taking that absolute positive tact, I'm building on some of the comments. So more clarity around the model, the flows, and how one links to the other is really, really important, because we need to understand what's already out there. And so if we're starting on the well-being bit, I don't think we need to commission loads of extra new services. We need to link up pathways, because I'm at the moment doing a mapping, because I've just found there's big devolved money from DWP for a work and health program, and we've got over 500 places for Merton residents. You know, usually with these programs we don't fill them. So for me there is a real piece of work to be done to say what's already out there, and I want to absolutely drop in the services that I've just recommissioned, adult substance misuse services. We are very happy with the new provider. It's a voluntary sector provider. Substance misuse and, you know, the low-level community mental health services have to work absolutely hand in glove. And making sure that the pathways are knitted together so that neither has a gap and neither duplicate. And then finally, also when we're thinking extra investment versus making use of what we've got, look across London, because very low level self-help. There is an offer in London, the digital mental well-being service now called Better Thinking. That's a universal service. Let's make sure that people know. I bet if we go round, how many of you know that? Very few. So a little bit more exploration first before we say we buy everything new again.
Patrice brought this to the patient engagement group, which was great, and they were thrilled that we were thinking in these terms. So I think that's got the patient backing. I think we need to know a lot more about what Sutton Uplift actually does, what benefits has it shown, what's been proven from that. And the voluntary sector, we've got the Mental Health Forum, we've got a lot of groups within Merton's voluntary sector that are already doing that low-level support for people with mental health illness and mental health issues. So I think we've got a really good basis there, but we do need to map it and we do need to pull it all together.
Mike, go.
I know this is mainly about adults, but I think CAMS needs to be thought about as part of the strategy.
So, I think there's two key things. One is we need to know a lot more about the model to understand it, and the question is, how far advanced is the thinking, and what's the process you're going through? When are we going to see something more solid back if it doesn't currently exist? And a lot of the questions relate, I think, to that lack of clarity about exactly what's being described.
So I was just going to respond to some of the bits and bobs around the money, investment, benefits realisation, and then hand over to Patrice to do the bit on the model and when will specs be ready and things like that. Is that okay? Just cover those two halves up. So question around the money and investment. So it is new money, but it's within the mental health investment standard. To Andrew's question before about are we disinvesting in secondary care to invest in this? Not exactly. However, if we can quantify benefits in secondary care, both in mental health services and elsewhere, then we will do that. If it's in mental health, we'll seek to reinvest it so we continue to meet the mental health investment standard and improve that side of services. We do believe, as Patrice has referred to, that there'll be significant benefit outside of mental health in implementing this model. Your point around the wider benefits realisation is a really good one. At the moment, the benefits realisation group within the CCG is considering it from a health perspective, but it shouldn't be too difficult. Particularly, we do have data to help us with this, to look at its impact in terms of employment and so on, and isolation and so on and so forth. So we will take that away as an action to build that into the work that we're doing. So I think from there, I'll hand over to Patrice for more about the model.
Okay. Andrew, sorry, can I just come back on that about the money? Because I understand all the stuff about the standard. I guess my point was, let's assume that it's £1 million. Is that £1 million sitting there in a reserve somewhere that we're not spending? That, I think that's the issue, isn't it?
So to answer the question, in theory, yes, because it's basically the money that we have to set aside each year as part of the mental health investment standard. I would have to say, and only when we start to see the numbers will we be able to comment. It feels to me like probably the mental health investment standard, the whole lot would go, and we would probably still need to find a little bit more, but the lion's share of it will come out of the investment standard in that year. But as to what the percentage we have to set aside, we will see. But as a working assumption, that's a reasonable approach to take.
So it's a documented reserve in the plan, if you go back to the plan.
Yeah. Thanks, James. I think that's my point.
Well,
it's sitting there as that's fine. That's good. Yeah. And then there's an issue of how do we then spend it? That's fine. Yeah. I was just getting a bit worried when we talk about the standard as sort of it's a figure that we should be aiming for. That's a bit different from real money that's reserved somewhere to spend it. That's the point. But you've confirmed that. Fine.
Let me just say something else though. I think whatever we've got in the plan for this year, going forward, I really think we need to think of the mental health investment standard as a minimum. Our starting point on mental health spend was low. And the investment standard is a percentage increase year on year. I do think that should be our minimum. I think we should be thinking about investment in mental health as a quip, frankly, because whatever you're investing in mental health, you're going to get savings in other bits, even of our own spend, before you start looking at the wider system benefits. So I would want to give ourselves a challenge to, can we really start to make a case for pushing that further?
Yeah, 100%. I'd agree with that.
Thank you. Right, so the procurement plan is to have a lead provider. Or they're described as 3 different lots, but we're hoping to get a lead provider who will provide those 3 different lots as a single entity. So for the service user, your passage between all 4 steps should be seamless. Hopefully you won't notice it. And as a commissioner, our discussion would be with a lead provider. This worked by serendipity in Sutton, whereby I think they did initially go out with 3 separate lots or 3 separate service specs, and as luck would have it, South West on St George's came back and said we can do all of it. And in that process, they brought on board voluntary sector providers to do the wellbeing bit. If I explain a bit about the wellbeing bit, I think we should have a degree of confidence that there are organisations in Merton who can deliver this service. If we look at Sutton Uplift, the voluntary sector organisations which are partnered with the Trust in that borough, they have a footprint already in Merton. I'm happy to share draft service specs with members of the governing body if that's what they would like, and can do that now. They are a work in progress. The wellbeing bit, or the social inclusion element, the way it works in Sutton, as I understand it, is not necessarily an employment support service or a social inclusion service. What they've employed is a number of, for want of a better word, navigators, and they link mental health service users with existing supports and services in the borough, so that I think in that model actually lends itself to people's social inclusion, rather than holding them in specific services for mental health service users. As has already been explained, the money, this will be a mixture of existing money and new money. So there is some money which I expect to come from the Mental Health Investment Standard. There is a service within South West on St George's which we have already served notice on, and the intention is to take the funds associated with that and incorporate it into the procurement plan for this suite of services. The primary care recovery element should work alongside GPs, not instead of GPs. So what we would hope they would do is take some of that work which currently happens in secondary mental health services, which is concerned with people who are essentially stable, and move it into a primary care setting. And in that context, have a greater focus on the person as a whole. So you should, yes, give that individual support and advice about taking their medication, living well, and if necessary, refer them to the social well-being element of the service, which might be particularly important. For example, if you do your physical health check, or the GP does a physical health check, and the person is a smoker, and we will make links with stop smoking services. That's the way I see the service working. I don't think it needs to take over or step on the feet of GPs. I think there are very effective and pragmatic approaches to working with people with severe mental illness existing in GP practices already, and there's no point in me trying to pretend that I can commission better than what's already there. So that's not what I'm hoping to do. Sorry, I'm trying to remember all the questions that were put. I'll come to that.
I mean, I think probably the key thing that would be helpful for us to understand, Patrice, is what are the next steps? So help us understand now. Okay, I think you've got general buy-in to the principle. What's your clinical involvement and your patient service user involvement in shaping this further? When will we see it as clinicians working with the CCG next, and when will we next see it back as a board?
Okay, so
describe that.
A draft business case for this precise service model was presented to CRG probably in May or April of this year, certainly a few months ago. And if I remember the meeting correctly, we did get endorsement in that setting for that. We have, as Claire's already mentioned, we have been through, we started off with the patient engagement group, and we've done a series of engagement meetings with members of the general public, if you like, about the service model. We've talked about this in detail. We've asked them to interrogate it and come back to us with ideas for amendments, so I can share feedback. We've written up those minutes, if you like, from those sessions, and I'm happy to share those with you. We've also got a primary mental health. We've got a mental health delivery group, which is a representative group, which has public health on there, of course, commissioners, representation from the local trust and the voluntary sector, and service users and carers. They are taking this plan through as like a project steering group. They will be looking at the service specs in detail and giving us further advice on amendments required to those. So what we hope to have by the end of the summer is a finalised business case which can go to EMT for permission to begin the formal procurement process.
So I think that's really helpful. What I think would be really good for the next governing body, so I think in September, because it sounds like you've got a lot of work that's going on between now and over the summer, is to actually set out, as Andrew said, the process that you've followed around the engagement both clinically and with the public and patient groups. If you need any more clinical support, I think you've got lots of people around the room who are standing very keen and informed and want to get involved. So I think we would probably want to have a discussion outside of the governing body with those on the governing body about how they might do that, and then bring back some of that process and what the proposal is going forward to the September governing body. What I wanted as well, you said you had sort of notes and minutes. Well, I think rather than the notes and minutes of all the meetings, I think maybe pick out some of the themes and how that's been put into your thinking and how you've listened to that going forwards.
I think it is probably worth saying that there's already been a couple of really detailed exec management team discussions about this, and actually within the paper it sets out that the detailed spec with all the work that's been done in terms of the clinical and patient engagement will be coming back in August. So it's not like this is waiting on a governing body discussion to get to the next stage of the governance process. That business case will be there, will be scrutinised by the EMT in the normal way, and we will actually, continue to work at pace through the process, even as we get ready to bring it back to the governing body in September, because I know that Josh and Patrice are keen to give ourselves as much headroom as possible on the process so that we are getting as much of a flying start as possible in Q4, given our commitments around the access rate in Q4. So, we will. This is a point in time. I think to be fair, we've taken quite a bit of detail out of this so that we can have a relatively principled discussion with the governing body rather than getting into a huge amount of detail. EMT will do the detail, and what you'll see in September is yes, and we're moving forwards, and here's the very detailed spec.
Any other comments before we move on? So I think in summary, Patrice, you've got a strong endorsement for the principles, and I think we're really looking forward to seeing what comes back.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been really helpful to me. Thank you.
Okay, we have Jonathan, and it is because you're going to give us an update on the Effective Commissioning Initiative update.
Afternoon, all. Nice to see you all again. So this is an update on 4 aspects of the Effective Commissioning Initiative work that we've been undertaking across South West London over the last year or so. So the first is where we are with the policy. The second is the implementation of that policy through a prior approval scheme. The third is where we are with the IFR, the individual funding requests process. And the final bit is what difference this has made in terms of activity levels and potential QIP gain across the system. So governing body members will recall in November 2017 we signed off a revised policy across South West London. That has had a range of benefits, and this piece of work was very much focused around quality improvement across South West London. And one of those areas of quality benefit, which I don't think was particularly expected, but it was clear to see, is that trusts have often talked about junior clinical staff being in a better position to say what procedures the patients will be able to access and what procedures are ineffective, and therefore patients will not be able to access them. People will be aware that there is a programme of work taking place across London. So the paper sets out what that looks like, and also I'm sure you're aware of the media coverage last week around the 17 procedures where there's a national consultation, I think, launched today in relation to the Effective Commissioning Initiative. It would be true to say that 15 of those 17 policy areas are already in the South West London work, and we've influenced the regional work and also sought to influence the national work as led the way on this in a number of areas. So that's the policy. In terms of the prior approval service itself, the details are all in the paper, and I'm sure you're in a long meeting, so I will whiz through them. But 9,000 patients have gone through the prior approval service since it went live at the beginning of January, and the paper details split down by trust and by CCG of those figures. So it's also worth noting the very low number of complaints received. There's only been one complaint with 8 other instances of people requesting further input given the decision that was made by the process through the prior approval programme. In terms of the individual funding requests between 2 governing bodies, I've just been interviewing for an IFR panel chair, and subject to them accepting, we will appoint an IFR panel chair who will work across all 6 CCGs in South West London. So moving away from a scheme that costs us around £250,000 to implement a year for less than actually 100 cases going through now, given prior approval, to a much more streamlined process that will operate with triage panels and full IFR panels taking place once across South West London. And the final section of the paper summarises, and it does exclude some areas, for example, cataract activity associated with Moorfields at St George's, but it does give you some details of the fact that the volume of activity against the 50 or so procedures in the ECI policy has reduced by around 2,000 cases. So there's 2,000 patients who are not receiving ineffective or non-demonstrable gains from their treatment that were in the past. And you can also see the financial benefit across South West London, around £3 million saving last year. Those figures are broken down by CCG and by CCG in terms of both activity and money. So you have that information, and whilst the trend line is consistent, obviously the numbers vary from CCG to CCG. This policy has been more comprehensively implemented in some providers than others, so certainly I think there's some opportunities for Merton CCG in relation to St George's, and you can see that represented in the figures too. And then finally, as this was very much about quality, you can see the procedures where actually, despite having processes that we put in place, workers continue to increase, whilst also seeing the many areas where it has decreased as a result of putting a consistent plan in place across South West London. So that is a whistle-stop tour through the work that we've been doing over the last 12 or 18 months, and it has got, I suppose the key message is that this is something we've been trying to put in place for a number of years in South West London, and we've been able to do it, and we've been able to do it at scale by working together.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sarah?
So I just want to thank Jonathan and the team and everybody that's been involved in this, because the clinical input into this across South West London has been considerable, both from GPs but also from our acute colleagues and from public health. And also we've had a lot of public and patient representation involved in this as well. And I think this is a huge success personally. I know that there will be teething problems, I know there will be issues, but this has been, we are now seen as forefront nationally on this. And we said we were going to do something across South West London, and I think we've done it, and I think we've done it very well. What I would also say is that the feedback that I've heard coming to governing bodies across South West London is actually, this is really helping general practice around how they have discussions with individual patients, because the way in which the information is given to practices means that they're looking at what's the alternatives for those patients, and they're giving them a more robust discussion around these areas rather than just saying no, that procedure is not available. So I've heard nothing but very positive feedback on this since we implemented. So I'm sure there's some negatives as well.
So Tim?
No, it's really just agreeing with Sarah. Unfortunately, with a lot of these things, particularly, let's say, some of the orthopaedics, it's about giving them a reasonable alternative, and so investing in a proper MSK pathway so people can get some decent physio, proper advice, weight loss programs, some of the other stuff around it. You do need the other primary care as a giver of this service. I need to be able to give a reasonable and valid alternative, and I think we're certainly commissioning those sorts of things. So yeah, well done.
Any other? Karen?
Mine's a question really. Do you have any feel for why the skin resurfacing of varicose veins has gone up when everything else has gone down? Do we have any answers for that?
I imagine as GPs you probably have a better answer than me in some ways to why that might be the case in terms of the patients coming through your doors. I suppose it's all about, do people meet the clinical criteria and the threshold coming through, and clearly in those areas against the policy as we currently define it, and of course we'll be refreshing that policy through the autumn, they do. So the short answer is no, I don't. I imagine if we asked a group of GPs, they would probably be able to give us a view about why it is the case. What we do have is data by trust, so what we also see is quite a significant degree of variability by trust as well in this, so that may or may not reflect local need.
So these are people that do meet the criteria and
Absolutely.
are having, okay, they're not people who are going through who
so this is spend against the area of policy. So we've just picked out the areas where some of the big financial shifts have taken place, but these patients are meeting the requirements of the policy, and this is just the spend that's happened in the year. Of course, some of it will relate to patients who may well have not gone through a prior approval process, at the start of the year, because it would not have been in place consistently across all trusts at the start of the year too.
Table that you've got where you've talked about the 2 years and then change. I understand where you talk about it's gone from 1 million down to 733, and that's a 34% reduction. I understand that. But what does the red one really mean? I don't really follow the implication of that.
Sorry, you say the red one. I'm not with you.
Maybe I'm looking.
Are we on the final page?
Yeah, so green
Yes.
green showing a reduction, and red showing an
spend,
increase in
and red
spend.
showing maybe the colour scheme isn't appropriate, given we talked about it being a quality-driven initiative, but from a financial point of view, green means reducing spend and red means increasing spend.
Yeah, that's what I thought it meant, but I didn't quite understand.
Okay. Is that sufficient clarification?
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else? This was... Oh, Mike, go.
Just a quick question about your thoughts about why the IFR request numbers have dropped.
Because more patients are going through prior approval, and a tick box form associated with the prior approval means that it's clearer what is genuinely an individual funding request and needs to go through that route. And that's a trend that all CCGs are seeing, which is part of the reason we're reviewing the arrangements to check they're aligned with actually the amount of focus and effort required.
I think from previous experience that one of the things that prior approval does is it reinforces the criteria for IFR being exceptional or rare. And previously I think sometimes things have gone through IFR that haven't genuinely been exceptional or rare, and actually when that line is very clear, then previous experience has been that a different conversation happens at the point of referral between the potential referring doctor into IFR and the patient about whether they genuinely are exceptional or refer and the chances of success in an IFR process, and that's when it starts to drop off. I think the other thing that IFR does quite well when you have prior approval and you have an explicit set of commissioning policies is, if you see more than about a dozen of something in IFR, it's not an IFR, you need a commissioning policy for it. So you kick things into the commissioning policy process. So, if you get your prior approval and your commissioning policies right, actually IFR should turn into, a very small number of very, very knotty cases, which is what it was always designed to do.
Marek?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to point to the fact that this is effective commissioning. That's what the whole process is meant to be, effective commissioning. The fact that there are some areas where there is an increase in spend perhaps just belies the attitude that is thought to be out there, that this is all about cutting costs. It's actually about providing effective care. Now, if it happens to be that effective care and through prior approval these cases have gone through, it simply means that these cases needed to go through. The only reason it would be wrong would be if those criteria were incorrect from the outset. But if those criteria are evidence-based, the cost has gone up because there's increased usage. It's because it's being effectively used.
From one of the other governing bodies, the GPs there actually took comfort from the fact that there were some that were increased, because what that proved was that actually we were making decisions based on the right clinical judgment rather than based on finance. We do know that if we do things effectively, they tend to be more cost effective, and I think we've shown that as well. But what it does show is it shows that actually things can go up as well as down, and actually that's the right thing to do.
Just one other point is there's actually a long-term benefit of treating varicose veins, and therefore you might reduce your on-spend of district nursing, long dressing clinics, wounds, ulcers and everything in 20 years' time. Most of us might not be here, but it is relevant.
Hence why most areas have actually, I don't know whether it's the case for South West London, but have had previously very tight, restrictive procedures on varicose vein surgery, and actually in many areas have loosened them because the evidence has been that the long-term benefit of actually not treating any of them is exactly that. So, and we were just speculating about whether what might have happened with varicose veins is that people have assumed that things aren't funded, and then when there's a really clear policy document, they actually realise that quite a bit is for exactly that reason. I think those stories are so important in terms of proving that we are doing this because it's about commissioning quality.
Good. Well, thank you, Jonathan, and it sounds like it's a very positive story, so well done.
And thank you to everyone involved in it, including people involved in Merton CCG. Very, very much appreciated all the work of people.
Thanks. Thank you. So we've noted that. Haven't had any questions in advance. Don't have any other business, so I shall bring the meeting to a close. We'll now move on to part 2, which is the confidential closed part of the meeting. I'll give people just a couple of minute break to make themselves comfortable, and then we shall reconvene.